O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about short pieces on thinking about thinking 3. This is a collection of previews of some of the shorter works we've put together. The first one is called Maintaining an Unstable Situation. And, we hear all the time that life is about balance. You need to find a balance between things. But the problem with that term is it sort of suggests that once you find balance, you kind of stay in balance. You're just kind of there. When really I think it's better to say that life is about maintaining instabilities. And this also gets to that distinction Johannes, the great Heidegger scholar, makes between managing problems and solving problems. We tend to think about all problems as things we can solve and then poof, they're gone. When really most of the main problems in life are things we can only manage. They're like cliffs we have to climb, but it's not like when you reach the top of the cliff vanishes. And you may have to figure out how to go back down, that you can't stay at the top all the time. I think also if we in our socio-political order think about life as balance, finding that, then we tend to lionize the middle, we tend to make being a moderate moral, when it really may not be the case that a moderate position in a given situation is the best. I think that conservative commentary, Jonah Goldberg, he has this part where he says, one side says, let's make a bridge, the other side says, let's not make a bridge. So someone comes along and says, well, let's make half a bridge. That doesn't make much sense. But if you have so much focus on the word balance, you can start to conflate that with moderate and middle and assume that the middle is the truth. Now, don't get me wrong. It does tend to be the case that the middle can be more empathetic to the two sides, and if it's the case that empathy and critical thinking are strongly related, as we've argued elsewhere, then the middle may have a higher probability of being right, but it doesn't necessarily follow. So I think we really need to think in terms of instabilities, and that also makes room for irony, paradox, tragedy, trade-offs of competing goods. That's what the word tragedy classically means, according to Martha Nussbaum. And so I think it's better to think about thought life, just like socio-political life, is about maintaining instabilities. The next piece is called Boredom Threatens Rationality. And the idea here, it's not a situation where there's nothing, where you literally have nothing to do. It's a state in which you don't see significance in what you could do, which is a big difference. Often we just kind of say with boredom, oh, there's nothing to do, but there's always something to do. The issue is just we don't see significance in the things we could do. And that's also a big deal, because if boredom is actually about seeing significance, what do we tend to think and reason about? What we find significant. And if we don't have the capacity to see significance, then our rational life is going to struggle, because we're not going to see a point about thinking about stuff, because there's no significance. And also the capacity to see significance could be tied to the ability to judge when one is satisfied or when what they have is sufficient, which seems to be really necessary to have a balance. And that's a point Johannes makes as well about the importance of the ability to judge sufficiency. And Daniel Z. and Vervaeke were talking about that as well. If we don't have the capacity to judge sufficiency, then we're just going to consume forever. And if boredom is to lose the capacity to judge significance, you may also with that lose the ability to judge when you've reached a stage of sufficiency. So boredom and consumption could be tied together, all while simultaneously boredom takes away the capacity to be rational. The next piece, which is inspired by Missing Axioms by Samuel Barnes, is called The Problem with Identifying Nihilism That Isn't There. And the question is there harm in calling someone a nihilist, even though Mr. Barnes, I think, successfully argues that technically we can't be nihilists because it's impossible to live nihilism. Nihilism is only something, you can only tell people you're a nihilist, you can't live or show that you're a nihilist. Well, as long as nihilism is a category in our thought and it's impossible, that means we could maybe misunderstand what's going on around us. And what's more likely is that when people claim to be nihilists, as opposed to being a situation in which people literally have no values, that could easily be a situation in which actually it's more like the Leo Strauss German nihilism, which generally means that people want to return to higher principles or else burn it all down. So there's something very extreme, very return to higher principles, or I don't care what happens. And of course, these are the seeds of fascism and totalitarianism and mob rule. So it's important to recognize that nihilism is a problematic category in our thinking. The next piece is called A Formula for Disaster. And this piece, and we had an O.G. Rose conversation about this, basically is getting into why it is so bad in relationships to have a formula that follows the structure. If you cared about X, you would have done Y. And basically, epistemologically, what this is saying is that we can determine people's values from what they do. That if people do X, it must mean they have Y value. When really, you can't draw that conclusion. It's like going from constant conjunction to natural law, as David Hume says. And likewise, as David Hume says, we need to realize our understanding of causality comes from common life. We likewise should judge people's, the people who we're in relationship with, perhaps, their intentions by our entire sum of common life with them, not just given events where they decided to hang out with their friend instead of take a walk with us or something like that. It's very the formula for disaster is very dangerous, and the O.G. Rose conversation expands on it. And there's also an O.G. Rose conversation on this piece called In Honor of Thoughtlessness. And to give a quick overview on that, it's really important to realize that thoughtlessness is not a simile for stupid, as we learned from Hannah Arendt. To be thoughtless about something is to not think about it. It's more like an axiom. And it's the foundation that makes thinking possible. If we don't have axioms, if we don't have assumptions, we literally couldn't think. So you have to be thoughtless about some things, but that doesn't mean you are stupid. But there can actually be a kind of honoring about not trying to go beyond thoughtlessness to really see what grounds our axioms is and to see if our axioms are justified, because then we can just be someone who lives by principles. And there's something about like living by principles and just doing what we think that's right is honorable in society. But it also can be very problematic because if you don't think about what you're doing, you can just kind of justify your action by being on grounds of principle as you make things worse. And as you make things worse, you absolve yourself the responsibility of those negative consequences. The next piece is called basic math. And generally, it's if the most idiotic, evil, wholesome, the most evil person on planet Earth said 2 + 2 = 4, that person would be right. And if Mother Teresa said 2 + 2 = 5, Mother Teresa would be wrong. Basically, it's just a review of ad hominem fallacies, which I think, unfortunately, really define political discourse today. Although you're a woke progressive, then you're crazy. Or if we go, oh, well, you're a liberal, you're a Trump supporter, you're nuts. But it doesn't follow that just because someone is crazy, that therefore, if they said 2 + 2 = 4, that they would be wrong. In the paper, we'll go through a lot of that. The next piece is called How Should We Live? And this really just wants to argue that pragmatism can actually help us determine what philosophical questions we should pursue. What is the heuristic by which you determine what philosophical questions are worth focusing on and which ones are not? That's actually a tough question. But pragmatism can actually help us figure that out. Like, for example, Charles W. Mills, in his incredible book, Blackness Visible, he makes the example where someone who's being oppressed, a slave, doesn't really ask the question, do other minds exist? Because the slave knows darn well other minds exist because he is unfortunately under the oppression of the master. So clearly the master exists. Likewise, the slave doesn't ask if reality is real. You hear that all the time. How do we know we're not in the matrix? So pragmatism and personal experiences like that, which are practically manifest, are manifest where someone has to practice that personal experience, can help us determine what philosophical questions to focus on, and maybe can even help provide us with some of the deepest answers to some of the deepest philosophical questions out there. And the piece will also get into some biography of philosophical life. The next piece is called Wisdom Can't Be Handed Off. This is the idea that knowledge can be transferred. It can be handed off. And what I mean by this is just by virtue of being born, I can receive the laptop. I can receive the collection of facts that people have had. I can receive exercise equipment. But wisdom can't be handed off. It can only be handed down. And what I mean by that is no one can pass their health on to you. No one can pass their discernment on to you. You have to earn it. Every single generation has to re-earn wisdom. But here's the problem. Since knowledge feels like wisdom, the experience of having wisdom transferred to us can make us think that we are also wiser. In the same way that if someone gives us our exercise equipment, we can feel like we're therefore a healthy person because, look, we have exercise equipment. And that sounds crazy, but it's very easy to confuse knowledge and wisdom, and we probably also subconsciously want wisdom to be knowledge because then it can be handed off to us. It's just given to us by virtue of us being born. And basically that describes all of technology. Just by virtue of being born, you are given the technology of the past, but you are not given the wisdom of the past. And so it's really important to realize that knowledge is handed off, but wisdom is only handed down. The next piece is called The Myth of Systems Builders. And basically, I'm just quite critical of the idea that there are philosophers out there who were systems builders. Obviously, they exist. Obviously, there's something about Kant and Hegel that looks like a system. But at the same time, if you actually read Hegel, it's full to the brim of more like phenomenological insight. Likewise, David Hume. Is David Hume a systems builder? Well, he wrote on a bunch of different subjects, but I'm not sure if I would call that a system. And you see, I think this is very important because if we think of all widespread thinking or thinking about many subjects as building a system, since we've kind of been trained to understand that long chains of deductions, to use that white headline, tend to be false, then we're going to think of all philosophy as false or all thinking through lots of different subjects as being contingent upon one another and falling apart, when there's a very big difference between thinking that covers a landscape, like walks across a landscape, and thinking that tries to build a tower. So we just need to realize that it's not the case that all philosophical thinking or critical thinking is systems building, that there is also walking across a landscape where one's conclusions about one subject do not rest upon the validity of prior investigations and so on and so forth in a long, like a Jenga tower or something like that. And again, if indeed thoughts were constructed on one another like a Jenga tower, the likelihood of the whole thing not falling apart somewhere would be very, very low. So it's really important to get the right metaphor. Again, metaphors matter, as we learned from Susan Sontag. The next piece is called Why Do We Need a Balance Between Ideas and Experiences? And basically, the idea here is that ideas are always about experiences or incorporating experiences. So if you don't have a lot of experiences, you're not going to have a lot to think about. Take a unicorn. You'll be like, well, I've never experienced a unicorn. Well, you've probably experienced a horn. You've experienced a horse. You've probably experienced the parts of a unicorn. And in your mind, you're just putting them together. So the piece is going to go through that we really need to understand that a lack of experiences means we're going to have a lack of material for thinking. So we need to balance thinking and experience. And everyone, if asked directly, knows this, but it's very easy to get so sucked up into thinking that we don't act. And likewise, it's so easy to get sucked up into acting that we don't think. So we need a balance between those things. The next piece is called The Limits of My Language Can Move. Wittgenstein had that great line where he said, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well, that would also mean that if you gain new language, then the limits of your world can expand. Also, I say all the time that if that's true what Wittgenstein said, then the expressions of my language are likewise the expressions of my world. So therefore, if and this is where philosophy can play a role, if the words love and like are conflated, then I exist in a world where there's no meaningful distinction between love and like. If I'm in a world where paradox and contradiction are conflated, then there's no meaningful distinction between those things. And that's literally going to transform the kind of world I'm in. And if it is the case that in objective reality, in actuality, there is a meaningful distinction between love and like, then I will be disconnected from actuality, and that could have practical consequences. Therefore, we should always be trying, and I think poets know this very well, that limitations on language are limitations on experience in the world. And of course, if you're missing out on certain experiences in the world, you also are missing out on the ability to know you're missing out on those experiences. The loss is total. The next piece is called René Girard and the Problem of Justification. And basically here, I would like to say that we use mimetic desire in order to make decisions, because since autonomous rationality is impossible, we can't be rational all the way down. We need to use something else other than rationality to figure out what we're going to do. And basically the main way we do that is by seeing what other people are doing. This is one of the reasons why people like Erich Fromm and some of those people are correct, that there's actually something in human beings that like totalitarianism, because then we don't have to make decisions for ourselves and be responsible for it. So I think there's actually a epistemological take on René Girard that's interesting. The next piece is called Focused on What We Cannot Solve. And here I just want to say that there's different kinds of focus. That daydreaming is a kind of focus, but you're thinking about a subject kind of going horizontal to it, not directly at it. You're thinking about it associationally, but there's still an orbit there when, like in the creative focus, when you're thinking about a story, but you're kind of also just letting your mind go. But then there's also the focus that is the traditional focus where you're really homing in on something and looking at it hard. The reason I think this is important is because if we don't consider daydreaming focus a kind of focus at all, then we're going to probably create a hierarchy where the traditional focus is more so focused than daydreaming. And if it is the case that daydreaming uniquely generates creativity and abstract reasoning that is not found in traditional focus, then we're going to cut us off in the name of quote unquote being focused. We're going to cut ourselves off from a source of creativity, solutions, and so on and so forth. So it's important to realize there are different kinds of focus. The focus of the artist and the focus of the engineer is perhaps a way we can say it. The next piece, which was also inspired by Samuel Barnes and the book on David Hume by Dr. Livingston, and it's called The Greatest Problem of Philosophy is Philosophy. And the idea here is that philosophy, we can philosophize about anything. There is no subject that cannot become a philosophical subject. And also philosophy can go on forever. It never stops. But also philosophy, if we don't make a distinction between the true and the rational, will attempt to be its own axiomatic grounding, and that's impossible. And what philosophy does, if it attempts this, is ultimately deconstruct itself. It becomes a force of destruction. And this is argued throughout O.G. Rose, mainly the paper Deconstructing Common Life. So here's the problem. If philosophy can consume everything, and it can be about everything, and it can never end, then if philosophy doesn't learn how to solve the problem of philosophy, then philosophy will destroy everything. And that's where I think we see in personal lives very philosophical people who don't know about the distinction between true and the rational, or good philosophy and bad philosophy, as Livingston said it. They fall into philosophical melancholy, is what Livingston calls it. So there's real practical consequences for not getting this distinction. The next piece is called We Must Begin Somewhere, and it's basically a restatement of some of Thomas Nagel's ideas, where he had that there's no such thing as a view from nowhere, that we all have to start somewhere. It's literally impossible for us to not start our lives already situated in some sort of ideological framework. It's just how it is. I mean, if otherwise we wouldn't have enough of a hold on the world to even begin understanding it. This is not inherently bad as long as we realize that our starting positions tend to be absorbed as opposed to earned. But when we absorb them, we necessarily experience them as earned, because if we didn't, they wouldn't feel legitimate to us or justified, and we wouldn't hold to them. So this is just a necessary situation, but that's perfectly fine as long as we realize it, and then we can begin trying to understand the good of it and the bad of it, and trying to make a new territory for ourselves that is not simply a product of what we've absorbed, because we need those changes. They can be very beneficial. The next piece is called Meteors, Craters, and the Continental Analytical Divide. This is featured in Reconstructing A is A. And the idea here is that there's a big difference between knowing by presence and knowing by absence. Let's say I come upon a crater that a meteor has left behind. I can never experience the meteor directly, but that doesn't mean I can't know anything about the meteor, because I can examine the crater that is left. I can start to reach maybe conclusions about its size, its composition, and so on and so forth. So there are ways to know by absence, even if I can never see the presence. However, unfortunately, this would not necessarily stand up to a hard analytical analysis, because I can never ever know for sure that the crater was a result of a meteor. Maybe somebody dug it as a trick or something like that. So it doesn't really hold to a very stringent epistemological framework, positivist framework. And this can also help us understand some of the differences between analytical philosophy and continental philosophy, where continental philosophy is often investigating subjects like the crater. They're trying to make conclusions about a meteor from the crater, where analytical philosophy is going to say, you can't really do that, and it's kind of a waste of time. Not always, that's a generality, but that, I think, generally, continental philosophy is trying to know by absence, while analytical philosophy is trying to know by presence. And they blur, obviously, but that's a key distinction. And lastly, and we just had an O.G. Rose conversation about this, it's what is a paradox? Basically, the paper argues that a paradox is not a contradiction. A paradox is when you have a combination of inconsistencies that don't negate because they never come together in a single point. A paradox is a contradiction through time, but never in a moment of space, and therefore there's no negation. Where a contradiction is where opposing inconsistencies come together, they meet, and therefore cancel out. So you could say a paradox is a contradiction through time, where a contradiction is a paradox in a moment of space, is a way you could put it. So they're similar. And this has real consequences, because human beings ultimately, I think, are more so paradoxes than stable selves. But that would sound like a problem unless you understand the paradox are not contradictions. So, and we discussed this in the O.G. Rose conversation. But anyway, this was short pieces on thinking about thinking 3. For more, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Instagram, Anchor, so on and so forth. And thank you for your time.